He stood utterly still, a rigid statue of defiance. Beneath his simple cloak, a creature clawed and tore, a wild fox ripping at his flesh, teeth sinking deep, blood blossoming silently into the rough fabric. His eyes remained fixed, unblinking. Not a muscle twitched, not a whimper escaped his lips, not a single tremor betrayed the agony consuming him from within. By the time the inspection concluded, the boy was already lost. He collapsed in a pool of his own making, succumbing to wounds that had been fatal long before they were seen. Death arrived in absolute silence, and Sparta, far from mourning, celebrated. This wasn't some embellished campfire tale spun to thrill. This was an exaggeration or the stuff of ancient myth. Multiple historical records, painstakingly preserved, recount this horrific event not as tragedy, but as triumph. It represented the zenith of their pedagogical ideal, the perfect student, the ultimate proof that their methods, however brutal, worked.
It was what happened when children were trained correctly. Today, a boy barely 7 years old was forcibly separated from his mother. He would not see her again, not truly, for years, perhaps ever. Tonight, he would sleep on a bed of rough reeds cut by his own small hands. Tomorrow, he would wake to a hunger so profound it was a deliberate instrument of state policy. He was expected to steal, not just encouraged, but required to steal food to survive. Should he be caught, a vicious meeting awaited him, not for the theft itself, mind you, but for the unforgivable failure of being discovered. By the time he reached 20, this same boy, now a man, would have stalked and killed an unarmed man in the suffocating darkness, with no pretense of trial, no flicker of hesitation. The state, in its chilling calculation, would proudly declare this an act of citizenship. What you are about to hear is not speculation.
It is documented fact, meticulously cross-referenced and corroborated by ancient historians who visited Sparta, bearing witness with their own eyes to a society unlike any other. This is how Sparta forged children into weapons. Not through soaring inspiration, nor through the raw courage of spirit, but through a systematic, remorseless psychological dismantling. And here lies the brutal truth no one ever tells you. It worked with such terrifying perfection that it utterly destroyed them. Let me paint the landscape of fear and control that birthed this system. Picture a city-state, a mere speck on the map, home to perhaps 9,000 full citizens at its absolute peak. Some ancient sources suggest even fewer. It was a population so small, so inherently fragile. Now juxtapose that image with the 200,000 people toiling on the land surrounding them. These were not foreign slaves, chained and shipped from distant conquered territories.
These were Greeks, speaking the same language, worshipping the same gods, sharing common ancestors. They were called helots. They outnumbered the Spartans by a staggering margin, anywhere from 7-1 to a terrifying 20-1, depending on the century. These helots tilled the soil, nurtured the crops, and harvested the food that sustained their oppressors. They inhabited the same valleys, traversed the same roads, spoke the same dialect. They knew the terrain intimately. They knew where weapons were cached. They knew precisely when the Spartan men were away, engaged in distant wars. And they remembered. They remembered when their grandparents had walked free, when these very lands had belonged to their own vibrant city-states before Sparta's iron grip had crushed them. Every single year, Sparta declared war on the helots. This wasn't some metaphorical posturing. It was an official, formal declaration. This wasn't about engaging in battles, for the helots were largely disarmed. No, this was about legality, a sinister stroke of policy. It transformed the act of killing a helot at any time, for any reason whatsoever, into a legal act of war rather than the crime of murder. Consider the profound psychological impact of such a decree on an entire society. You wake each day surrounded by a populace outnumbering you 10 to 1. These are the very people who cultivate your food, people who could, with a mere thought, poison it, people who know your children's names, who have watched them grow. You cannot escape, you cannot flee. Spartan citizens were expressly forbidden from extensive travel or living abroad. Isolation was not merely a preference, it was the law, enforced with an iron fist. Faced with this impossible reality, you were left with only two stark options: live in perpetual paralyzing fear, or annihilate fear entirely. Sparta chose the latter. But achieving such an unprecedented level of control demanded something far beyond conventional military training. Soldiers, after all, have breaking points. Soldiers feel fear. Soldiers sometimes question orders, especially when those orders violently clash with basic human instincts. Sparta required something that would simply not break. The agoge was their answer. Birth, in Sparta, offered no guarantee of life. A father did not name his newborn son. A mother did not possess the ultimate authority to decide if her child would live or die. Instead, the infant was immediately brought before the elders, the gerousia. These were venerable men, over 60 years old, elected for life, the very bedrock of Spartan authority. They would scrutinize the baby's tiny body, searching for the faintest deformities, any hint of weakness, unusual proportions, or subtle signs of future illness. Modern scholars still debate the exact fate of infants deemed unfit.
The enduring, chilling image of babies hurled into a chasm called the apothetae largely stems from Plutarch, who wrote centuries after Sparta's zenith and may have been repeating popular legend. However, exposure was undeniably real, a documented practice across the wider Greek world. An unwanted infant might be left outside the city limits, left to perish from the elements or wild animals, or perhaps, if fate was particularly cruel, taken by someone desperate enough to raise a child not their own. Either way, for those who failed the inspection, the father returned home without his son. For those who passed this initial, brutal inspection, early childhood was mercifully brief. You remained with your mother until the age of 7. During these precious years, you learned to speak, to walk, and most importantly, to internalize the profound truth that you were Spartan, which meant you were fundamentally unlike any other Greek. At the age of 7, the state took you.
This was not mepher, it was a physical, irrevocable act. You left your home. You entered the agoge. You would not return to live with your family, not at 8, not at 15, not even at 25. Your name was immediately inscribed on a new list. Your very identity now belonged entirely to the institution. The transition was instantaneous, brutal in its finality. There was no preparation, no gentle adjustment. One day, you slept safe within your mother's house. The very next, you found yourself in a stark barracks, amidst 100 other boys, all under the unyielding supervision of a young man barely older than you. The barracks offered no comfort, no solace. Boys slept on the same rushes, the very reeds they had cut themselves from the cold banks of the Eurotas River. In the bitter grip of winter, they were permitted the meager luxury of adding thistledown for a whisper of warmth. That was the entirety of their bedding. One cloak. Dawn, that was the clothing ration, year-round, a single rough garment to protect them from the elements. Shoes were an unheard-of indulgence, forbidden in summer, in winter, on rocky ground, or on frozen earth. The soles of their feet hardened into calloused leather. This was no accident. It was a deliberate, calculated design. Spartan military doctrine would later hinge on rapid movement across treacherous terrain. Shoes, they reasoned, were a weakness. Shoes could be lost. Feet, however, remained. But the most ingeniously cruel element of their conditioning was food. They were fed, yes, but never enough. The rations were deliberately, precisely insufficient. A boy would finish his meal, still gnawingly hungry. He would go to bed hungry. He would wake hungry. Plutarch, in his detailed accounts, described the portion as calculated to make them keen to satisfy their needs through their own resourcefulness. The chilling translation: you were expected to steal.
Not from merchants outside Sparta. That was simply unavailable. Spartan citizens did not engage in such base trade. Their entire economy hummed on the forced labor of helots. And boys, once within the agoge, did not leave the training grounds. They stole from each other. They stole from the meager storage areas. They stole from the communal messes. And here was the perverse mechanism that made it all function. Stealing itself was not punished. Getting caught was punished. If you stole successfully, you ate, you survived. You had, in their twisted logic, demonstrated the very resourcefulness a Spartan needed to possess. If you were caught, you were beaten, publicly and brutally, in front of your entire unit. Not because stealing was inherently wrong, but because incompetence was utterly unacceptable. This distinction was paramount. This was not moral education. This was operant conditioning, pure and unadulterated.
The lesson drilled into their very bones was not "do not steal," but rather "do not fail." And so we return to the chilling tale that has survived across multiple ancient sources. A boy, his name lost to time, stole a fox. Accounts vary as to his purpose, perhaps to eat it, perhaps as a supreme test of his own courage and discipline. He hid the living animal beneath his single rough cloak. During an inspection, the fox, wild with fear and hunger, began its relentless assault, tearing into his stomach, clawing, biting, drawing deep crimson. The boy stood silent, his expression a mask of absolute neutrality. He uttered no cry, made no movement, offered no hint of the horrifying struggle unfolding beneath his garment. By the time the inspection concluded, the fox had inflicted mortal wounds. Modern readers, accustomed to different values, recoil from this story, labeling it insane, suicidal. But for Sparta, it laid bare a fundamental truth.
Death was infinitely preferable to the slightest hint of weakness. Pain was an acceptable price for unwavering obedience. Physical destruction, however complete, was a lighter burden than the crushing weight of social disgrace. This narrative, far from being shunned, was recounted for centuries, a revered standard, the ultimate illustration of what it meant to be Spartan. The boys, once integrated into the agoge, were organized into strict units called agulai, or herds. Each herd was overseen by an aren, typically a young man around 20 years old. This aren wielded absolute authority over the younger boys under his charge. He could issue punishments, often participating directly in the beatings. His word was not merely law, it was an unbreakable decree. Yet even the aren operated under a watchful eye.
His leadership was constantly evaluated, his ability to manage and discipline the boys directly influencing his own advancement within the Spartan hierarchy.
This created a chillingly efficient, self-enforcing mechanism. The victim of the system inexorably became its enforcer, knowing full well that his own loyalty was continuously being assessed based on his willingness to perpetuate the very brutality he had endured. Every interaction was observed, every moment a silent, relentless test. There were no private spaces, no fleeting moments of solitude, no opportunity whatsoever to cultivate an independent identity separate from the pervasive surveillance of the group. This was the environment, stark and unyielding, where personality was expected to form. From the tender age of 7 through the formative years leading up to 20, the very period when human beings typically forge their sense of self, their values, their understanding of relationships, there was only the group, only the rigid hierarchy, only the omnipresent state. Any emotional attachment to family, any lingering tenderness, was systematically and mercilessly suppressed.
Boys did not return home for holidays. There were no comforting family visits to the Spartan barracks. Mothers did not soothe their sons' scraped knees or quiet their fears. One Spartan mother, her name immortalized in a famous anecdote, famously dispatched her son to battle with a single, unyielding instruction: "Come back with your shield or on it." Modern ears might interpret this as a dramatic, albeit fierce, exhortation to bravery, but listen to its true, chilling resonance: come back victorious or come back dead. There was no other acceptable outcome. Do not come back defeated. Do not return if you fled. Do not dare show your face if you dropped your shield to run faster. If you returned alive, yet defeated, you were not welcome. That was not encouragement. It was an absolute threat, uttered by the very woman who had given him life.
The agoge did not merely train boys, it meticulously conditioned the entire society to relentlessly reinforce the same uncompromising value system. Mothers, wives, sisters, everyone was a participant in this intricate mechanism of shame and conformity. Physical training was a relentless, constant regimen: wrestling, running, combat drills that pushed their young bodies to the brink of exhaustion. Yet, ancient sources consistently emphasize that the physical component, however grueling, was always secondary to something far more insidious. Plutarch, observing with keen insight, declared that the agoge was primarily designed to produce obedience, endurance, and only then victory in battle. Obedience was listed first, and this was no mere accident. The most grueling, most infamous test of this conditioning was the diamastagosis, the whipping ordeal performed at the altar of Artemis Orthia. Boys were flayed, whipped publicly in front of spectators.
This was not a punishment for a specific transgression. It was a demonstration. The paramount goal was to endure the agony without crying out, without betraying the slightest hint of pain, for as long as humanly possible. Some, in their unwavering attempt to uphold the ideal, died during the ritual itself. In later
identified as strong, capable, or defiant, the very ones who possessed the potential to lead a rebellion, to organize resistance. The youths killed them quietly, swiftly, in the suffocating darkness, without trial, without warning. Then, just as silently, they returned to their hidden refuges. This chilling ritual continued for an unspecified period, perhaps weeks, possibly months.
Scholars still debate the exact frequency and scale of the crypteia. Some argue it was a regular, institutionalized practice, a constant undercurrent of terror. Others suggest it was activated only during periods of heightened tension, a gruesome form of preemptive strike. But on one point, the sources are chillingly consistent. It happened. Its purpose was not military. The helots were unarmed, chattel, not enemy soldiers in a conventional sense. Its purpose was profoundly psychological. Consider what this did to an 18-year-old. You had spent 11 years internalizing that obedience was survival, that suffering was normal, that your identity was inextricably bound to the collective. Now you were commanded, kill someone who has not attacked you, someone who is unarmed, someone who is enslaved by your state. Kill them in secret. Do not hesitate. Do not question. If you faltered, you had failed. If you questioned, your loyalty was incomplete.
This was the final test, the ultimate severing. The last potential attachment to shared humanity was brutally cut away. You were not merely a Greek among Greeks. You were not a person bound by conventional moral boundaries. You were a Spartan. You did precisely what the state required, and if that meant extinguishing the life of an unarmed man in the dark because he simply appeared too strong, too proud, too capable, then that is precisely what you did. The ones who returned from the crypteia without hesitation, without trauma, without doubt, those became full citizens. The crypteia was a filter, a horrific crucible that separated those who still possessed limits, however faint, from those who had none left. At the age of 20, you became a full-time soldier, but independence remained a distant, forbidden dream. You still lived in the barracks, ate in the communal messes, the syssitia. Every meal was shared with your unit, meticulously supervised, ritualized.
The food, famously, was deliberately unpleasant. The notorious black broth was infamous even in ancient times. One foreign visitor, after tasting it, reportedly exclaimed, "Now I understand why Spartans are so willing to die." The point was never nutrition, it was absolute uniformity. Luxury was weakness, pleasure was a dangerous distraction. Marriage was technically permitted, but a Spartan man never truly lived with his wife. He visited her, often in the dead of night, in secrecy, sneaking away from the barracks to see her briefly, then returning before dawn. Children were born, but fathers rarely raised them. The state, in its relentless grip, assumed that role. Finally, at the ripe old age of 30, after 23 years immersed in this unyielding system, a man finally achieved what was deemed full citizenship. He could attend the assembly, he could cast a vote, but even then, his life remained institutionalized.
He still lived in the barracks, still ate in the communal messes, still trained daily. This relentless regimen continued until the age of 60. Consider that immense timeline. From the age of 7 to 60, a Spartan man's entire existence was institutionalized. 53 years of communal living, of constant surveillance, of ritualized programmed behavior. By the time you reached 60, You had spent the vast majority of your life within this singular, all-consuming system. There was no you separate from it. There was no identity that had been forged outside the impenetrable walls of institutional control.